With the mainspring totally clean now, we're able to re-lubricate it and try to get that back, put back into the clock. Before I do the lubrication on the mainspring, I always try to do a little lubrication on the moving parts included with the great wheel, as it's called. So with my oiler, I'm going to put a drop or two under the ratchet wheel here, so that can lubricate as that ratchet wheel is rotated. I'm going to put a little drop under the click as well, so that easily moves in and out of the ratchet wheel. I'm going to put a little drop of oil on the rivet that holds the click to the great wheel. And I'm also going to put a little drop of oil on the click spring to ensure that as this clock is wound, that complete mechanism is working just as it should. Doesn't bind, and everything is operating nice and smoothly. So that's very important. That's an important first step. I do this before I put it back in the clock, because it's easier to do when it's outside the clock than when it's assembled. So let's talk a little bit now about what needs to be done with the mainspring in order to lubricate it. I haven't found an easy way to lubricate a mainspring without getting oil all over you. So one thing you might want to try is putting on some gloves, disposable gloves, in order to help with that process. When you do the final assembly of the clock, gloves are also useful so you don't get fingerprints on them. So let me just glove up at this stage. And talk a little bit about lubricating oil. You don't need anything fancy. I just use a horological lubricant. Other people recommend other things. There's several different types out there. There's inexpensive types, there's more expensive types. Talk to some people and see what they say. But what I do is I take the lubricating oil and I decant it into a jar. I typically use what we might call a chemical brush, something like this one. That's a brand new one. My wife does some painting, and I've got an old brush here that she used in her art stuff that wasn't useful anymore, so I've used this. I just cut the edge off here. I decant the lubricant into a jar that I can put a lid on. Very seldom you don't use all the lubricant that you need, but you don't want to take it directly from the jar. You want to decant it so you don't put any impurities back into that. Any kind of jar will work, and again, it's just a way to decant from the container that you have. Now, I've talked to people over the years, and everybody's got a little special technique that they use to lubricate mainsprings. I've heard of people putting them in the mainspring winder and taking a piece of cloth that has been saturated with the lubricant and then just running that over that as far as they could go. And then ultimately, when you get very close to those inside coils, you're not able to do that. You do need to use a brush. The technique I use is taking the lubricant and effectively painting or putting lubricant on the inside part of the mainspring. What you don't want to do is put in too little lubricant. What you don't want to do is put in too much lubricant. And that's always kind of a fine line to walk. So I find by doing it with this technique, I'm using less lubricant and I'm putting it where it needs to be. And once all these coils get put together, they literally smear the oil from one side to the other. And usually we don't have too much lubricant dripping out, being over lubricated. For those inside coils that are so tightly wound together, I'll just take the brush and paint a little bit in there, making sure it's going to spread once this mainspring is completely wound up. So after this stage, we'll take it to the mainspring winder. Now that we have the mainspring lubricated, we need to put our C-clamp on, our mainspring clamp on, in order to get this so we can put it back in the clock. We need a couple of things to do that. One of the things we need is a letdown key. And this is the letdown key that fits nicely into the Ollie Baker mainspring winder. And I'm just going to make sure that this is the one that fits the winding square. And there it is. Looks like a number 6. So I'll put this in the mainspring winder. Now, when you're using the mainspring winder, a couple of safety items. One of them is using safety glasses. Okay, so I'm going to put those on right now. There are different types of safety glasses you can use. These go over your prescription glasses. We have another style here that fits right over your eyes for protection. And if I had any question about this mainspring, as far as safety goes, I'll even go to a chemical splash hood, just to make sure if something goes wrong with a questionable mainspring, I'm going to be able to protect my eyes and my face. Additionally, you need a leather glove. Being right-handed, like I am, I'll be using the glove like this. Usually I keep the mainspring covered, but for the means of the video, I'll take my hand away so you can see what's going on. These round mainspring clamps used to come with a new mainspring. When you purchased a new mainspring, this is what contained them. Nowadays we find wire being used, a piece of wire that looks like this one here. I've also even seen mainsprings being contained with a zip tie. Kind of questionable to me because I know plastic can break down, but that's the way they're doing it. Personally, I really like these flat mainsprings clamps, because they just take up a little bit less surface area thickness, and especially between the plates, chiming clocks and striking clocks, these I prefer. So that's what I'm going to use for this example here. Now with the Ollie Baker, we've got a couple of things to note before we try to put the clamp on this mainspring. One of the things is the Ollie Baker has this pillar that moves here, and it's got these additional features that are typically used with barreled mainsprings, and that's a whole nother type of thing. So I'm going to remove those. But what I do need to use is this post here. So I'm going to take this and kind of put it on what looks like backwards, but that's going to give me what I need in order to put the mainspring clamp on this mainspring. I've got the correct letdown key, so let's get started. This I just lubricated. You should see some of the wet lubricant on there. And remember, I only painted sort of one side, so it'll kind of smear itself. And what I need to do is position the arbor in the top part here. And I'm pushing in on this pillar, and I'm going to tighten that in place. I'm going to check to make sure from back and forth here there's no movement, because the last thing you want is the possibility of this assembly coming out when you're trying to tighten it down. I'm going to take the loop end of the mainspring, this is the loop end, and put it on that black metal post that we saw a moment ago. And now we're pretty well situated. As you can see, I keep kind of taking some of the excess lubricant off my hands, because it just, no matter what you do at this point in the stage, it makes a mess. So I'm going to take a look from the end here to see which way I need to wind this in order to get that spring tightened down. So I'm going to go in a counterclockwise direction. The ratchet is in the other setting, so I'm going to take a little bit off, rotational movement there, flip the ratchet to the other direction, And now I can wind up the movement, wind up the mainspring. As you can see, it rotated off to the front here. It's starting to get some energy. I'm going to make sure that loop end doesn't come off. And these types of open mainsprings are so easy to work with compared to the barreled mainsprings. What I would normally do is keep winding and keep my hand covering this. But again, I want you to see what's going on. Watch how these different spirals of this mainspring sort of begin to slide one another as that mainspring lubricant is doing its job. I would make sure that this doesn't spill over one direction or another. This mainspring is behaving, so I'm happy about that. Again, I would try to cover this as much as possible. Going to keep going. And you only need to wind this as tight as needed to put the mainspring clamp on. Now, just a suggestion, kind of a word to the wise. If I had removed this mainspring from the arbor, I might want to perform an operation that's called setting the mainspring on the arbor. And what that involves is just you keep cranking until you get to the very end. And what that does is it takes that inner coil and forms it around the arbor. This way it's not likely to pop off on you. And the more you do with mainsprings, you'll know what I mean there, that sometimes these things kind of pop off on you. You really don't want that. So I'm going to take a little pressure off, unwind this slightly, and again I'm going to wind it tight again so I can set that inner coil. I'm happy with that. I'm going to take the mainspring clamp, put it in place, and generally speaking, when you do so, you need to make sure there's a little bit of a tail, meaning the very end, the loop end has about an inch or so, so you don't want to put that clamp too close to the tail. So again, just so you can visualize what's happening here, I'll try to work from another direction. When you see that mainspring fall in the opposite direction, you probably have it fully unwound in this particular case. The mainspring clamp is containing that. Usually after that step, when I loosen the nut here on this pillar, sometimes there's maybe another quarter turn, half turn left in there. If you keep going too much to unwind it, you might pop that arbor off of the mainspring, and then you've got to reattach it. So let's take a look, see how we did here. And as you can see, I do have some oil, lubricating oil, coming out. I'm going to mop that up as best as I can. You want to have that to happen. You don't want too much, but you certainly want enough to lubricate that mainspring. So that's how we get this ready to be assembled back in the clock movement. It was totally cleaned, lubricated, and now we're ready to put it back in the clock. At this point, we're ready for the final assembly of this clock. When I do a final assembly, I typically put nice new clean gloves on. The purpose for that is you don't want to get any fingerprints on the movement plates, on the front or back movement plates, or on the wheels. Your body's oils, your body's salt, you know, when you sweat, it's kind of a salty perspiration liquid there, and that will literally etch into the brass. So that's something you want to be careful of, especially the more important the clock is. So we're going to do our final assembly here. A couple of quick comments. The escapement pallets here, I dressed those up previously with some buff sticks to get those nice and smooth. They were not in bad shape, but using these buff sticks, I was able to shine up those pallets a little bit, so that makes a good, as friction-free contact as possible with the escape wheel. So that's one thing I did. There was also some rust oxidation on this arbor, so I used some very fine wet and dry paper to get that cleaned up, and again, that went into the cleaners, ultrasonic cleaner after that. This is the pendulum rod. Notice it's got a couple of different crazy shapes in it because of the way this movement is so compact and the way it's created. And what I did is I used the same wet and dry paper to burnish. You see that's a little bit shinier there than up at this end. To burnish this so it's nice and smooth, because this pendulum rod rides in the crutch loop like so, and so you want to make sure that's nice and smooth there, and you'll see that once we get this assembled. You may remember that I had broken or it was damaged the little pin that held the suspension where it belonged. Well, I'll have to get a new tapered pin in order to deal with that. But let's do our final assembly here. Make sure you have your notebook with all the details found here, so you know which wheel goes where. With a time only, it's much easier, especially when you graduate up to a chiming clock. You've got 3 trains and you've got all types of levers and other things. By taking pictures of the movement or just making some quick notes, you'll be able to better see what's going on. Okay, when I build a clock like this, I typically start from the bottom of the movement to the top. And starting from the bottom, I will take and put in the mainspring, the great wheel. Based upon my notes, the loop end of the mainspring goes here. And I need to make sure that this gets anchored in the proper location here on this plate. There we go. And make sure that's held down where it should be. Again, as always, you do manage to get a little bit of extra lubricant, so I'm just going to kind of back that out of the way. So looking at the wheels that we have here, I need to put in the great wheel, which is T1 in this case. I'm now going to deal with T2, and this one here is going to be placed over here, like so. T3 is attached to the front plate, so I'm not going to do anything with that except when this goes together. That will go in for T3. T4 is up here, and this one has the brass part of it, brass part of the wheel going downwards. And then finally our escape wheel is over here, and that's with the brass part going upwards, and they mate together like so. Again, a lot of people say you should be able to put a clock together without all these notes, and they can only go together one way, but especially in the beginning, it does not hurt at all to be a little bit more careful and make some good notes and kind of be very pragmatic about disassembly and reassembly. Now, what's interesting with this movement is our escapement is between the plates. So when this goes together with the top plate, front plate going in, I need to have that escapement sort of in place as it is now. It's important you organize pieces, parts, to make sure what goes between the plates and the pieces, parts that go outside the plates. So let's see if we can get this assembled now. Let's see if we can put this front plate on. And again, I have to be a little bit more cautious here because this escapement goes between the plates. So this is going to assemble something like this. Notice the long arbor, the winding square here, needs to be fitted first. And you see how that wants to drop down already. So we want to get that in proper location. Now for assembly like this, what I try to do is try to be seated so I can look through the movement, kind of in this direction here. You can't see everything you need to see from the top, so I'm going to sit down here, and I've got my chair lowered as low as I can get so I can see between here. And what I'm going to be doing is rotating this probably back and forth a little bit until I see where everything needs to be situated. And I'll use magnification for this. Sometimes tweezers come in handy, but because this is a time only and I've got plenty of room to work here, I probably won't need tweezers. We'll see how it goes. So I start from the bottom of the movement to the top. So I've got these little nuts here that I'm just going to put on, not even finger tight, but just get them started so that bottom plate doesn't pop out on me. Okay, and now I'm just going to make sure pivot holes get put where they properly belong. So in other words, from T1, the great wheel, that's in position, I'm going to try to install T2 into its pivot hole. T2 is located over here. And I'm going to have to get T3 located a little bit better first. Okay, the movement plate went down just a touch, which is how I'm going to work from this. If you put too much force on here, you're liable to bend a pivot, which you don't want to do. And let's try to get this aligned here. Okay, so now I've got T2 situated, and what I'm going to do is take these two nuts here and just give them a little bit of a tighten down so T2 doesn't pop out on me. This escapement fell out on me, so I'm going to try to get that kind of established where it needs to be. T2 is in position. You see the pivot came up. T3 is in position, so I'm going to rotate this around so I can get to T4. I'm going to be pressing down just a little bit to make sure this seats properly. Okay, so I've got T4 in position. Okay, and now T5. So at this point, I'm getting close to getting proper assembly. I'm going to tighten down the two nuts that are down near the great wheel. And I'm going to just, again, finger tight, put these two nuts on here. Just barely start them. And all I need to finish up here is to put the escapement arbor in. I'm going to lift up, well, I'm going to have to remove this nut here fully. And I'm going to kind of lift up here in order to get the escapement arbor in position where it needs to be. Making sure the escape wheel dropped out. So I'll put that over in position here. And that's the sound that every clockmaker loves to hear, when those plates slap together, when the plates drop. That is just the happiest sound to a clockmaker. And I'll get this started here now. So I've got all the pivots where they belong, which is the good news. I need to tighten down on these nuts here. So I've got my nut driver set, and I think that one's too big. And that one I can just get started here. Yep, one more size smaller. Now with this particular movement, you have to make sure that the plates are totally dropped down. And what I mean by that is you can see here that there's a little space between the plate and the pillar. This pillar needs to be repositioned over this way just a touch. You heard that drop there? So I'm going to tighten that one down. And this one here, that one is looking fine. And this one did not quite go in position. I'm going to loosen that slightly, and that needs to be repositioned ever so slightly. There we go. Keep that pushing down on there. Get that one good and tight. And this last one is not properly seated. Some are made this way. Some are a little, that one's not dropped in. Some are a little more forgiving. Some are made a little bit differently, so you got to be careful of that. So I'm going to get these nuts on here good and tight. Sometimes I'll use the extra torque I can get with the black handle, black attachment. Okay, so now we have those on. I'm going to just give a quick look here. Everything seems to be free. Nothing seems to be binding, so that's a good sign. So now let's assemble the outside part here, and then we'll see where we're at. One of the things that we need to include is putting on the what's called the motion work wheels, and that's these here. This washer goes on the top of the minute wheel, like so, and then this hour wheel drops on top like that. So I'll get a screwdriver for that. So I just need to tighten down this screw here that has that little washer on it, so the hour pipe stays in place where it needs to be. And like so. So the last assembly part before we talk about lubrication is to be able to position this pendulum rod with the suspension spring in the proper location. So what I need to do now is get a tapered pin in there, because remember we broke the one when we were removing it. So for this clock I just need to get a little tapered pin over there so that suspension space stays in place where we need it to be. And I'm thinking one of these sizes in here might work for that. And that one should be just fine. And this tapered pin needs to go through the post here, as well as the suspension spring. There we go. Notice it's quite long, so I'm going to cut off the excess that I don't need. And make sure this stays in position. I'll give it a little bit of force there. And for this one, I'm going to put a little bit of a bend here, just so it can't drop out on us. And now it's plenty big for the next person to come through. Okay, so after this, we're on to lubrication. I always tell people in workshops with me, you always lubricate a clock. You don't oil a clock. You can charge more if you lubricate a clock than if you oil it. So keep that in the back of your mind. Couple of parts that we need for lubrication. Well, one is obviously the lubricant. What type of oil is to be used? These are drip oilers that are very, very handy for being on house calls. I don't like to use them when I'm in a controlled workshop environment because I like to control the amount of lubricant that I'm putting in a certain spot. This is horological oil, and it's a lot less expensive than some of the Swiss or French lubricants that are out there. And if you talk to people, if you look in the repair catalogs, you'll find all different types of lubricants that are used. So it's a choice between some very expensive lubricants, which will last you a long time, or some low-cost lubricants that also will last quite a long time. Again, I recommend talking to some other people to see what they use. So after the lubricant, after the oil, we need a way to apply the oil, and this is an oiler. It comes in a pack of 3. The smaller ones, the red, the blue, are for watches especially, and I'm using this yellow one that has a much wider tip, almost like a shovel at the end. More surface area picks up more lubricant, and this way you can transfer it a little bit faster. You can also take a brass wire, and by taking that brass wire and hammering it on a vise, you can get a flat, make sure it's nice and smooth so it doesn't scratch the brass, but you can make your own oiler. You don't have to buy an oiler like that one. Occasionally, it's good to have something called a piece of pith wood, because that is how the watchmaker cleans off the tip of the oiler. Because if a watchmaker uses even a paper towel, there could be some lint included there, and those fibers are enough to stop a clock as well as a watch. So you got to be careful about that. And then finally, an oil cup. This is a fancy wooden one. They make them out of plastic these days. This is a piece of glass or a piece of agate stone in there, and that's where we'll put our oil so we can decant it from the oiler and then apply it in this fashion to the points that need to be lubricated. If we use this drip oiler and we touch something contaminated, old oil, particulate, dust, we're liable to transfer that to another location. And again, especially for watches, that's something you don't want to do. For clocks, they're a little bit more forgiving. So I'm going to use this oiler, and I'm going to fill up the oil cup that I have here. I never get a phone call until we start videotaping. So what I'm going to do at this point now is I'm going to decant some of the lubricant into the oil cup here. This is the lubricant I'm going to be using for this clock movement. And there's a number of different parts of a clock that need lubrication. One of those parts is called the pivot holes, and we talked about polishing and burnishing pivots, and so now I'm going to lubricate those pivot holes. And if you notice, I'm slowly moving from the oil cup I'm acquiring lubricant onto the tip of the oiler, and I'm transferring it to the pivot. Now, this particular movement has oil sinks in it. Some movement plates don't have oil sinks in it. What you don't want to do is overfill the oil sinks. If there's too much oil in the oil sinks, once this gets mounted vertically into the case, that oil is going to drip out. Depending upon the quality of the clock, I might wear gloves because I don't want fingerprints on this clock movement plates. So that's something else to keep in mind. But what I'm doing right now is I'm transferring lubricant to all of the pivots that are coming through. This particular case, I'm lubricating the great wheel, or T1. Notice I'm going back and forth, picking up some oil on the oiler, and then transferring it to the pivot as well as to the oil sink. So I'll do this for each wheel going up the train. So this process would continue for all of the pivots on the front plate, as well as all the pivots on the back plate. Now you can see on this back plate, other than the bushings that I put in, which is this one up here, there are no oil sinks. So for this particular one, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious. And what I mean by cautious, I'm not going to put too much oil in those pivot locations because I don't want that lubricant to drip down the side of the plate and basically pull the lubricant out from the pivot where I want it to be. Remember, previously we already lubricated the mainspring, so that's all done already. So I would go and lubricate all of the pivot holes. I'm going to put some lubricant on the pallet faces. The pallets, the escapement pallet faces that interact with the escape wheel. I'm going to transfer some lubricant to a few teeth of the escape wheel. Another good place where lubricant should be. And let me get that other pallet face. And a few more escape wheel teeth. The arbor that holds the escapement pallets, as well as the pendulum crutch, needs to be lubricated. Some of those are external. This has an internal escapement. So I'm going to make sure that arbor has lubrication put on it. As you're transferring the oil from one point to another, it's really interesting. With magnification, you can see how by capillary action, the oil, the lubricant, pulls itself right into the pivot hole where you want it to be. It generally stays there. This clock also has a way, of course, to set the hands separate to the train. And that has a clutch. And that clutch is inside. And I'm going to put a couple of drops of oil on where the friction clutch is, so that doesn't freeze in one place. And when we go to set the time, we don't bend the hands or damage the hands or anything like that. Once all the pivot holes are done, pallet faces, a couple of the escape wheel teeth, the clutch so we can set the time, everything that revolves 360 degrees, including the motion works here. We don't put any lubricant down the hour pipe, but we do put some on that front pivot and on this 360 degree moving minute wheel here. So I'll make sure I lubricate that as well. And after you do that, the movement is then completely lubricated, ready to go into a test stand. One thing I always try to remember to do is to take the mainspring clamp off. So I'm going to wind this now and try to remove that clamp. And then we're going to talk about putting this in a movement test stand. Depending upon the amount of work you put into a movement, bushings for example, how much damage there was, if there was a broken mainspring or something like that, it's always good to test run them. Now some people are so confident in their ability that they skip that phase and just put it right in the case. And that's a possibility too. This being a time-only movement, I would be tempted to do that. But again, it comes down to how many repairs you have done to it, how easy it is to put into movement, and so forth and so on. With this one, I'm going to put it in a test stand to start with. Now, this is one of the simpler, lesser expensive test stands that are out there. The problem with it is you have to make sure you can put this in the test stand, and that's a good sign when it starts to take off just like that. But you have to put this in the test stand so it's in there properly and not liable to work itself out and fall out. So this one isn't all that desirable. So we're going to try another test stand. And these are out there. And they get to be a little bit more expensive when they have these kind of pincher fingers here. But this one works very effectively. And I can clamp this right down, and this would work well. On the base here, there's no adjustments for putting it in beat. So that's a limitation with this test stand. But what's nice about it is it does hold a lot of different types of movements. So finally, the test stand that I'm going to utilize is this wooden one here. What I like about it is it fits a number of different types of movements. And there's adjustments to help put this in beat. Takes a little bit, takes a few moments or two to kind of get this situated in the test stand. But what it provides you with is a lot of stability. It's got 4 feet, sits on the workbench, and it just keeps things nice and solid so you can wind it. You can take a look at things, make sure they're doing what they should. And make sure before you put this back in the case, everything is fine. There we go. That's one. And then I'll put one more here. And I could put some fasteners at the bottom, and I might just do that, but we'll see how this attaches here first. And as you can see that this movement is already running, so that is a very good sign that what we've done during this general movement servicing is what was needed. And we got plenty of stability, so I think I'm not even going to put those feet on the bottom because we're going just fine. So I'll put the pendulum bob on at this stage. And what I'm going to do now is check to see if it's in beat. Now, there's ways to determine if this is precisely in beat or not. I know when I was a beginning clockmaker, it was very difficult for me to hear if something wasn't beat. And in fact, I had a mentor, Ed, who at that time, he was in his 80s, and I was younger than I am now. And I would say, well, this is in beat, Ed. And he would say, it's not in beat. And I go, what do you mean it's not in beat? And so we'd pull out one of the clock watch timers, and he was always right and I was always wrong. So it's just one of those things there. But in this particular case, I want to determine if this is in beat. Now, one thing you can also do is take a little bit of lubricating oil or some grease, and I put a little drop in the crutch loop. And that also helps keep things fully lubricated, burnished, and properly functioning. So with the timer, there's two basic types that are out there. There's one called a microset, that's what we have here, and another one called a time trax. Some of these just have acoustical amplification, but some of them give you all types of readouts, especially useful for clocks and watches. So I'm going to set this up to see if this clock movement is in beat. I'll turn it on. I've got to go through a little bit of a process in order to turn the microphone on, turn the speaker on. And if you can hear that, you can hear things are not quite in beat. So I'm going to go to a setting called beat error, begin options, and I can see that I'm at about plus 30 and varying around there. If I pick up on one end of the test movement stand, it's gotten worse. Put that back down. When I pick up on this end, do you hear how nice and sweet it became? Nice and even ticks and tocks. So what I need to do is use these adjustable feet here and adjust them so this lifts up slightly on this side. And as long as I get down to 0 or single digits, I'm going to go ahead with this. And I'm down at around 4, minus 2 to 0. So I'm going to stop here. So now this movement is in beat. Some people will say to me, well, why didn't I put a level on here? Why didn't I adjust it according to level? And the problem is, until this movement goes into the case that it's going to live in, you really don't know what's level and what isn't level. It's important to make sure that that pendulum rod stays in the center of that crutch. I might have a little bit of adjustment to do there, but I'll do that after a little bit. But right now, this has been running since I started it. And whenever you do any test running of a clock, put the hands on. Put the hands on right away. Because what you want to do is try to begin to get this to regulate so it keeps time properly. And the moment you put the hands on, you can make sure that this is going to set it to the time that it should be, and you can make adjustments each day whenever necessary. So here, working in the workshop today, we're coming up on about 4 o'clock. So I'm going to set that about 4. I don't have a dial on there, so I can't get it real precise. What I'll do with this movement, make sure it's fully wound and let this run for at least 8 days. Make sure I get a full week's winding out of it before I do anything else. This way I know the bushings I put in and all the other servicing I did is proper and okay before it goes into the clock case itself. The movement has been running consistently for over a week now, and we'll be talking about how I've gone about to regulate it. But I noticed something pretty interesting when I put the timer on this, and I wanted to show you the results that I see. So if you take a look at the display from the microset, you notice it's at +2, 0, going to -2, -4, -5, -6, -5, -3, -2. Now it's +1, +3, +4. And if you pay attention, it keeps oscillating through that, going from a plus, say, 5 or 4, back to 0, and then a -4 or 5, something like that. And what that tells us is the escape wheel isn't perfectly concentric to the arbor, meaning when that escape wheel was planted on that arbor, it moved a little bit one way or the other. So it's very hard to get things just absolutely perfect for that reason. Sometimes things aren't made perfect, and we have to keep that in mind. But now let me show you what I've been doing over the last week or so, trying to get this clock into beat. I don't have it in its enclosure yet. We're going to do that in a few minutes. I don't have the dial on, so these are approximations. But I started on a Monday, and these are the notes I make for myself so I know how to regulate the clock and how the clock is doing. On Monday, I did a full wind and set. And I made a note here that it was about 2 p.m. that I did that. I came back in on Wednesday and noticed it was about 10 minutes slow. And again, without a dial on it, it's very hard for me to get precise, but that was the estimate that I have there. So I reset the hands approximately, usually top of the hour, bottom of the hour, something like that, for the correct time. And I took the pendulum and the rating nut here at the bottom and turned it up approximately a half a turn. I left it running. I left it running to Friday, and I noticed rather than being 10 minutes slow, I'm about 5 minutes slow now. And so what I needed to do again, take the pendulum bob, regulate, use the regulating nut, and move that pendulum up just a little bit, just slightly. On Monday, I wanted to ensure that this would run at least a week. It's an 8-day clock, so it's running from Monday to Monday. So I did another full wind. I set it. I was only a minute off, again, without a dial, approximating as best as I can. So I turned that rating nut to bring the pendulum bob up just a touch. Now when I do this, put the dial on, put it in its case, I'll have to do some more rating of this, but at least I'm close now. If I did anything with the pendulum rod and I noticed it was 10 minutes slow, I might take that rating nut and move it all the way to the top just to make sure that I can get it in beat, meaning it should run fast if I've done that. Otherwise, taking these small little movements here may take a lot more time to get the clock regulated. But the good news is it ran for over a week. Everything looks good. And now we're going to remove this clock from the test movement stand and put it in its case. At this stage, we're going to remove the movement from the test stand and get it cased up in the case that it came in. Before you move a clock ever, you want to remove the pendulum bob so you don't damage the suspension spring, anything like that. And now I'm going to remove these little nuts and bolts here that are holding the movement in place. So I'll take that off. And I'll take this one off. Put them on the side. And remove the test stand and get the case where this clock came from. The hands, before we install the movement back into its case, the hands are held on with a little hand nut there, threaded hand nut. And now I've got to be careful to lower this into the enclosure so I don't damage anything, and make sure everything does fit just the way it should. So far, so good. And now we're going to fasten the movement to the case with 4 wood screws. And what makes this task a little bit easier is using a split screwdriver like this one here. With the split screwdriver, you're able to hold those screws right in place so you can get them started. So let's do that. Sometimes a magnetized screwdriver works fine too. I just use this to start the screw. I don't do a full tightening with the split screwdriver because you can distort the 2 sleeves of it, and that would damage it and make it less useful in the future. So I just put the screws in just to start them. And here's number 3. And then the last one, number 4. So I'll get a regular plain straight blade screwdriver at this stage and just tighten those down. I'm not going to over tighten. I don't want to strip the wood out and then have another repair trying to get that to hold properly in place. So just get those nice and tight, all 4 of them, so they stay in place and the movement doesn't move around, especially during the winding process. We have the movement back in the case, and at this particular stage I don't want to put the dial on. And the reason being is I want to hang this on a wall first to make sure it's going to be properly in beat before I put the dial on. So at this particular stage, what I'm going to do is stop here, not put the dial on, and try to get it mounted vertically and put it on either a test fixture or a wall, and then try to get it in beat. And I'll show you how we get these objects in beat in a moment. Right now the clock is being held in a fixture as opposed to being put on a wall. Makes it a little bit easier for the videoing. If you see that the clock is perfectly vertical now, that's what we're looking for. Because we don't know if this is going to be in beat or out of beat, depending upon how this goes into the enclosure. If I put the beat amplifier on it, you can clearly hear that this is not in beat, although it's nice and vertical. So what has to happen now is we're going to bend the crutch wire one direction or another. Notice at this stage it even stopped functioning, okay, because it was so far on a beat. So I'm going to see which way this needs to be bent. Stop there. And now you can hear it's much more in beat. So it's going to have to be bent over that direction. So I'm going to make sure the clock is nice and level like it would be on the wall. And I'm going to try to get my fingers in here in order to bend the crutch wire in that direction. Let's see how I did. You can hear a big difference from there. And on the timer, I'm at +6, +7, +6. It'd take a little bit of time for it to dampen out. +10, +12 right now. So I might want to go in that direction a little bit more. But let me see, because we know that escape wheel isn't on there perfectly concentrically. It's down to +7, +6. So I'm going to bend this a little bit more in that direction and see if it stays a little more centered around 0. I'm not bending it very much, needless to say. I'm in the negative column right now, so I might have gone too far. And it's -15, -13, -12. It's coming back to single digits now. Might have gone a little bit too far. So I'm going to go back the other direction just a touch. And try to stay centered around 0. -8, -6, -3, I'm getting a little bit of fluctuation. Now I'm in double digits again. You can probably hear that. So I'm going to try to bend it just a touch more in this direction here. And be very patient to let this settle out. I'm in the plus column. And let's see if this goes towards 0, possibly into the negative column. Not as close as I want to be. Let's see if I went too far. I'm going to tip it this way on a beat. This might be as good as it gets. We have a nice amplitude. We're into double digits here, but quickly it's going to return back to single digits. Like now. And I think this is a good place to stop. So now that it's perfectly level, it's in beat, I'm going to put the dial on. Normally I would put this back on the bench in order to put the dial on. We're going to give it a try here with the video going and see if I can get this dial put on. Well, it's on the test fixture here. When you put a dial back on, you usually like to have the key on the winding square. That helps line everything up a little bit. Again, don't over tighten these screws because you'll wind up stripping out the little bit of wood that is holding them in place. Okay, and we'll put the hands back on. Now that we have a dial, I'm going to try to properly locate the hands where they belong. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. It's best to get the hands kind of aligned right at 12 o'clock. And then you're sure that they'll be correct the rest of the way around the dial. Make sure I get it on the winding square. Minute hand square, I should say. I'm going to move that back a little bit. And now we can set the time. For whatever time it is. And there you have it. Over the last 4 segments of the videos you've been watching, we had this little time-only Waterbury clock. Not exactly a museum piece, but we certainly come to love it. We disassembled it completely, separated the plates. We put it through a cleaning process. We polished the pivots. We burnished the pivots. We put a couple of bushings in. We cleaned the whole thing again, reassembled, put it in a test movement stand to test run it. And now it's been running successfully for the last couple of weeks, keeping good time here in the School of Horology. If you enjoyed the video, like, and subscribe. And be sure to head over to NAWCC.org for all things horology. That's linked below in the description. My name is Ken DeLuca, Education Director. Thank you for watching.